In 1865, the United States was in complete disarray during the Civil War. Even though some 4 million slaves got their freedom back, the Reconstruction process of the South introduced huge changes. In the upcoming years, President Andrew Jackson would sign a bill creating black codes to restrict labor and behavior of former slaves and African Americans. Outraged in the North because of these codes, African Americans during the Reconstruction led the triumph of the more radical wing Republican Party. The start of blacks gaining a voice in government for the first time in history was in 1867, winning elections in Southern state legislatures and even the U.S. Congress. However, many people did not like the fact that blacks were starting to be an impact on government, including the Ku Klux Klan. The KKK would later reverse the changes brought by radical Reconstruction in a violent backlash that restored white supremacy in the South. Because the Civil War was a pressing issue, President Abraham Lincoln did not make abolition of slavery a goal, because he feared it would drive the border slave states into Confederacy and anger more Northerners. The African Americans at this time said enough is enough and decided to gather by thousands to the Union line as Lincoln's troops marched to the South. This caused Lincoln to create the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed slaves in the Confederate States. By January 1st, blacks enlisted in the Union Army, reaching some 18,000 men. When the war ended 2 months later, Lincoln signed a bill stating that the U.S. Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen's, and Abandoned Lands, also known as the Freedmen's Bureau, was to help former black slaves and poor whites in the South with the transition to slavery to freedom. The Freedmen's Bureau was created out of abolitionist concern for freed slaves. It provided white and black refugees in the South with medical care, education, and redistribution of abandoned lands to former slaves.
The 13th Amendment was proof that progress never comes without a struggle. America has a dark history of slavery and prejudice. It took a brave act of Congress to cause a revolution and end the practice of slavery. The struggle before the 13th Amendment was huge. People thought that things were getting better just because the Emancipation Proclamation had been passed. But in reality, it just made their lives harder. When the Emancipation Proclamation passed, it technically only made slavery illegal in the rebellious states, but it did not give African American slaves their freedom. Instead, they were treated as second-class citizens and were given salaries that were just to cover up the fact that they were in fact still slaves. People even said that the years after slavery were the most barbaric, uncivilized manifestations of hate they had ever lived by. White supremacy was at its peak. The social sentiment was one of whites being above it all. If a black man was walking on one side of the street and a white man was walking on the other, the black man was expected to tip his hat for that white man. Even though African Americans were still being treated as so, they still fought for their rights and made Congress realize they needed to make a change. On June 16, 1864, Congress took its first vote on whether or not they were going to pass the 13th Amendment. The amendment fell 13 votes short, so it could become a law. According to an article, that summer, President Lincoln's position on the 13th Amendment evolved. In his party's convention, he said, "It is time for utter and complete extirpation of slavery," and in accepting nomination, he would call for a federal amendment because banning slavery was a fitting and necessary conclusion to the war. After winning the election, he called for Congress to vote once again on the 13th Amendment. Thanks to the pressure he decided to put on Congress, on January 31st, 1865, Congress declared with a shaky voice that the amendment had passed by a 119 to 56 vote. This amendment was the beginning of the civil rights movement. It helped bring black people together so that they could realize how far they could get if they set their minds to it. Even with major setbacks that the white men tried to bring them down with, such as black codes, black people still rose above, and as a result came the 14th and 15th Amendment.
The 14th Amendment was passed by Congress 1866, ratified on July 28, 1868. It's one of the most important amendments in the Constitution. It states that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state in where they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law in which shall abridge the privileges. Although this amendment benefited many freed slaves in the United States, it contradicted itself in excluding enslaved women from voting and becoming citizens. The goal of this amendment was to ensure that the Civil Rights Act passed in 1866 would remain valid in making sure that all people were to be given full and equal benefit of all laws. It was also to empower the federal government, stamp out oppression in the South, and enforce civil rights of freed blacks. It was supposed to ensure due process, equal protection, and individual rights of all people in the country. Section 2 of the amendment took out the 3/5 clause from the Constitution that counted slaves as 3/5 of a person, clarifying that all residents, no matter the race, should be counted as one whole person. Section 2 of the amendment also included the word male, which meant that women were to be excluded from it. It only ensured that men over the age of 21 could vote no matter their race. Women were devastated since they had no say in voting, so they began to speak up for themselves. In some states, freed blacks 21 and over were still prevented from voting. Therefore, the 14th Amendment failed to protect blacks and their rights, including the women. Women attempted to use it to ensure their right to vote and use it against the government. African American men also began to speak up in the states wherein they were denied to vote. Because of this, the 15th Amendment came to be.
And finally, the last amendment that was added to the Constitution during the Reconstruction era was the 15th Amendment. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. When this amendment passed, the Constitution specifically defined citizenship to males, women including African Americans. They felt that they were robbed from their rights since they had so much to do with the Civil War. This amendment came to be shortly after when the Civil War ended in 1865. This time was known as the Reconstruction era. Although people were happy and festive, still 4 million slaves wanted to know what their status was going to be moving forward. Then a struggle between the North and the South shifts from the battlefield to the political round. The U.S. government had to send an army to occupy the South, and during the time that they were there, 3 historical amendments passed to the Constitution. Women then came to the realization that they weren't being recognized. That is why they had the convention at Seneca Falls, where women came together and educated themselves on the problem of inequality that they were facing, where men were looking at them as less. Their Great Awakening is what really guided them to do the convention at Seneca Falls, because that's when the church gave the women roles of power, so they knew what it was like to be in that power. They realized that they could do it. That is when women really started to break barriers. However, they stopped the convention because of the Civil War to help out in almost every aspect. They helped the men. They helped cook the food, made the clothes. Even after that, they still weren't recognized for all the work that they had done. Women were only seen as property. They believed women couldn't think from themselves and that they were weak-willed. The amendment gave citizenship to anyone that would come into the country. However, it would be excluding all women. Women were very labeled at this time. They did everything that they could to get recognized and to gain the privilege of having rights, but it still wasn't successful. The amendment came to be because free male slaves wanted a status as well as women did. Free male slaves were then able to vote, but still restricted women completely. Although women didn't get the right to vote, they still never gave up, and that is later on until 1920 when they finally gained the right to vote.